The Pirates of Penzance thing, by the way.
Four score and 17 years ago, some dude pissed off his neighbor, took his slaves, and cut shit up for everyone.
Okay, with that, this is the first podcast of the Futurism New Deal discussions, hosted by Arizona Transhumanist Party members Johan Ben Zion and Caius Anthony, and anybody else who wants to call us and give us a hard time. And what do you want to say about the Futurist New Deal, Anthony? Tell us a little bit about your views of the Futurist New Deal from a libertarian perspective.
Well, I think it's important to be able to bring support from all sides of the aisle. And for a while there, it looked like the Libertarian Party was going to be capable of that. But ultimately, I think our compassions outweigh our conservatism. So in that way, transhumanism seems to be sort of, I hate to consider everything a Band-Aid, but it seems to be the patchwork with bringing American voters together on common topics. Nobody wants to steal from their neighbor, nobody wants to necessarily be responsible for everybody else's woes, but we all do feel for each other. So if we can create a system whereby our ability to feel for each other and our ability to also, enjoy the fruits of our own labors are both respected, then the Futurist New Deal could be the solution to that.
And I'm looking, so the presumptive frontrunner in the race that we're talking about, the Futurist New Deal, is a transhumanist party platform. And a transhumanist party primary is going on right now. You and I know this. Not everybody might. And that primary will be decided in the second week of August in a week-long e-vote. And there are a couple of candidates in that race, three of whom I know a little bit. And we've talked about a little bit. The presumptive frontrunner in that race, insofar as any polling data can be compiled or presumed, is a woman named Rachel Haywire. Do you regard her as a libertarian in the sense that you've described?
Based solely on what she's posted in her platforms, I don't know her personally. I would say she's probably more on that libertarian vein, particularly when it comes to her Second Amendment support and so on and so forth. But I think she's a little conflicted. It's one thing to call for the support of XYZ, the funding of XYZ, and another thing to have a plan to actually fund those things. Because like it or not, we're still living in a monetary-based capitalist society, and that's not going to change overnight. Laying the groundwork for the eventual evolution beyond money is important, but I don't really think that she has a firm idea of how to get us there.
And I would say that her what she brings to the table is a lot better than what I was expecting. Honestly, I was expecting a couple of sawdust pill hawkers and a couple of far-right libertarian utopianists in this race. And the fact that the three most vocal candidates are basically all people who would support humane economic policies to a high degree or higher degree is actually a shock to me.
I would agree. I expected a little bit more precision in the candidates, and instead what I see is a lot of potential in every round. So, after this race is over and we're running our candidate, I think we should all focus on still coming together, putting aside the campaign challenges, and continue to work towards these common goals.
Yeah. And we've had some conversations, she and I have had some conversations in various Facebook groups where I kind of goofed on her a little bit about having a more right-wing history than the other candidates. But in all fairness, her platform does speak for itself. I don't think it's as good as the Futurist New Deal, and I don't think she has an operation that's as focused as ours, not by a country mile. But it is not fair to describe her in the present context as presently being a techno-fascist.
Well,
Um,
you would know more about that than I. I haven't really considered the techno-fascist mentality until very recently. It's just here on my radar.
yeah.
So,
So I'm using the term transhumanist, neo-reactionary, and techno-fascist synonymously here. Um, a
okay.
neo-reactionary is an extreme hard-right position, a little bit similar to something like a monarchist. It's a person who does not really believe in representative governance or in um, human development for most people in the way that we think of it
I
in our
sort of,
republic.
right,
Um,
I see sort of in contrast to our voting government platform that's designed to give much more and thorough representation to the populace as a whole.
right. In the way that we have a platform that is ultimately intended to be a stepping stone to full e-governance, and the way that we want to fix the problems that we see in our very maladaptive. I mean, there's any number of outside watchdog agencies who look at the United States right now, and they say that the United States is no longer a functioning democracy, and
And there's a lot of evidence to
and
support that.
in some sense that could be um, attributed to the success of neo-reactionary forces or similar type forces, like the political operations of men like Charles Koch, or to perhaps in some ways a lesser degree Peter Thiel, although in some ways Peter Thiel might be regarded as a sort of the closest living embodiment of a neo-reactionary overlord. But I also find some things about Peter Thiel to be actually quite helpful. For example, an overwhelming emphasis on a longevity escape velocity, and it's if there's one thing that I could bring to a discussion in transhumanism, it would be uh, that this word is turned to a universal longevity escape velocity, and hopefully to put a ticking clock on that in people's minds, because as the sooner that comes, the sooner a lot of people's lives will effectively be saved,
Well, you
and
remember not to get too far back in history, but you remember the effect that the atomic clock or the nuclear clock had on the Cold War era. It really drove home the sense of urgency of we need to do something about this.
oh yeah,
Um, so
agent
guys,
and that agency is still active today and very influential. When they
yes,
every time they revise their figures, it's big news. Um,
so that
yeah, I would
that's an
I
that's
would
an
like
important thing.
I would like it if we had some kind of rubric for discussing moves towards a universal longevity escape velocity in some similar way. And I think that big data being what it is and what it can become, I don't think that's beyond the pale.
Not at all. It's something. It's something we should reach out to some of those, as you put it, the big data companies, and see if they can get on board.
Yes.
But
Uh,
go ahead.
well, yeah. Let's talk about UBI and let's talk a little bit about some of our more localized quote unquote programs at some point, like maybe the health
Yeah.
savings accounts
Yeah.
concepts, and these some of the other things in the futurist New Deal that we would see as stepping stones ultimately to universal longevity escape velocity.
Let's specifically hit those then.
Okay, well, let's start with UBI.
Okay.
Okay, so some people might argue that uh, um, Andrew Yang's UBI of about 13,000, pardon me, yeah, about $13,000 a year, $12,000 a year, is a more even if they're both funded, and funding is not an issue. The the hit to the economy, which I believe is in some sense a sham argument, because there's just What I think of when I think of this is these municipalities and studies that have just automatically housed homeless people and found that there's been a 3 to 5 fold reduction in costs as a result of doing so. This is a very good analogy for UBI, in my view. The costs of not doing these things may be somewhat hidden, but they are very, very real and larger than not doing so. And But some people would say that a $52,000 UBI that ours is, which is funded from the leasing of federal lands as well as reforms to the tax code, that this $52,000 UBI is too high. That we want to encourage people to still work, and that maybe Andrew Yang's $12,000 one is more to get people out of the danger zone, but still allow them force them to remain in the workforce. What would you say to that?
Well, let me jump on that. So here's the thing. The $12,000 a year model that Andrew Yang is proposing, certain changes notwithstanding, really just kind of looks like the Canadian model. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's his position. And $12,000 for a person working who is underpaid or underemployed will certainly make a huge difference in their life. And one could argue that it's more fiscally responsible, but that should not be the end of the story. We can definitely get to a grown-up professional living if we rearrange a few things. But the $52,000 a year benchmark is a goal. It's a goal. And as we kind of pointed out in the Futurist NewDeal infographics, there's steps to getting there already kind of built in. One of them is figuring out exactly how much we're spending in other social support programs like, Social Security disability, welfare, housing assistance, food stamps, even veterans disability benefits, and replacing it with a $52,000 a year UBI. That takes care of potentially $2.1 trillion of the estimated $57 trillion cost just by not making it redundant. And then the rest of it, between practical and rational tax reforms that take the burden off the individual worker, holds the federal spending far more accountable than it actually is. And then, by using Golden Eastman's model of monetizing the national forest lands in a environmentally sane way, it more than funds the ability for every adult American citizen to relax and enjoy life or pursue other things that might lead to more productive things. But the important part is that it also frees up our manufacturing base with the burden of human labor. When you have human laborers working in your facility, not only are you, under the current system, not only are you paying their salary, but you're paying almost twice their salary in payroll taxes and unemployment insurance and so on and so on and so forth. It's a huge expense for any manufacturing company to employ, or any company really, to employ human labor. If they are freed up to automate that human labor, well, that's great. Their production values are going to go through the roof. Under a futurist tax code, it's going to benefit the country as a whole and thereby the UBI system. But what do you do about the worker? And that's where getting everybody to that $52,000 a year mark is super important. That's a grown-up living wage, and if you have two adults in a household of any sort of relationship dynamic, let's a total of $104,000 a year comes into that household. That is a significant difference in their lives. That is, paying off debt. That's staying away from debt in the future. That's guaranteeing a future for their children who may go into those computer sciences and those engineering fields that we need them to in order to really get to that technological state for us. And that's already great too much.
Yes, and there has been any number of studies that demonstrate that a middle class lifestyle is a very, very good predictor of those kind of outcomes in childcare that you just described.
I would
Um,
agree. Yeah.
and it's an area that I mean, honestly, our middle class has been legislated against. We've
I would agree.
and it's turned into a horror show. It's the kind of horror show that allows for demagogues pointing fingers at border security or other issues which may be of significant importance, but not foremost in this set of circumstances. The economic policy matters are always going to be, it's the economy, stupid. But
Yeah. No.
Zoltan Istvin, I'm not calling you stupid. I hope you don't.
No, no, no. It's Bill Clinton reference. I got it.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
was it.
Um, the Zoltan Istvin's articles, numerous articles that have been written by him and about him and this public land lease program. And his numbers were a little bit similar to ours in terms of the amount that he wanted to fund the payouts for this UBI. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
You could pretty much call him the grandfather at this point.
Yes. So not an our tax plan is not a direct continuation of what Zoltan Istvin worked on in 2016 and around that time. But in many ways, there's a lot of parallels, and I hope people will not chafe at the idea of us wanting to continue his work. He's been a great leader and founder within this movement, and we also do want to focus on e-government in this platform, which I regard generally voting issues and the suppression of representative governance more generally as big of a problem as these humane economic policy issues in our society. Would you agree?
I would agree. And if you don't mind, I'd like to actually throw out a scenario that might be an example of a functional way that e-governance can be affected by every voter.
Mm-hmm.
Do you mind?
Yes, please.
Okay. So let's use the example of the Obama phone. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Typically it's a low end smartphone, but it's available to a significant number of people that can't afford the run.
Yes.
But you could arguably say that almost every American at this point has access to a smartphone or can have access to a public computer somewhere. That being said, with our ability to track the origination of data, with our ability to track whose IP address, from where, login, and so on and so forth, it's not a huge leap to say that an e-voting strategy is every bit as secure, and honestly, I would argue far more secure than our current paper or punch ballot system.
Mm-hmm. And wait, I want to say something about the Obama phone because that program predates the Obama administration by some decades. This low income program providing phones to people. It predates the smartphone era. And
but it's publicly known now.
Yes.
In the,
But
in the Eurosphere.
I just wanted to point out that this program is called Lifeline Assistance, and that it has been around for a while. I don't see any. I wasn't pointing out that I object to the term Obama phone. I just wanted to add a little context there.
No, that's good. That's good. It's one example of yet another politician taking credit for things that already existed.
Well, I mean, that's a colloquialism. He didn't really take credit for it. People kind of associated it with him. But
Fair enough.
yeah.
But anyway, it's not an unreasonable scenario where there's an election cycle coming up, something pops up on your phone similar to an Amber Alert or a presidential alert, and your options are right there in front of you. Gennady uses it on the Transhumanist Party voting, except he does the tiered voting system, which I also happen to enjoy, where you can simply make your cases right there. It's a one-time use, and you have voted. You have done your civic duty. You didn't have to wait at long lines. You didn't have to take time off from work. You didn't have to figure out transportation. You didn't have to figure out if you had the right voting credentials. If you didn't, it wouldn't have appeared on your phone.
Yes. and
It's a
and
way to streamline this and drastically reduce the cost of our election cycle.
yes, and the this is an issue that is important, so I think it bears repeating. Our current voting systems are partially automated or fully automated in little siloed ways, but they are riddled with graft, and to the point where there's really not any great departure between the historical trope of burning the ballot box and what we have in the United States today, which is really no better. But this issue is misframed by people on the left, and I think across the political spectrum, when people talk about going back to paper ballots to avoid this problem, because we have technological solutions that build in the necessary security and transparency to solve these problems at a lower cost than these voting machine systems that we currently use.
Right, and these voting machines, these digital punch machines, however you want to refer to them, we outsource those.
Yeah, privatization, my favorite thing.
Yeah, you want to talk about scratch? How many backs do you think were scratched in order to pull that deal?
Yeah.
And we need to eliminate that. We need to eliminate any potential of that.
Yes.
I think e-voting is one of the. I think e-voting, e-commerce, e-politics, those are the methods by which, from the 21st century on, we are going to eliminate opportunities for bad actors, as the right is so fond of using the phrase, to eliminate opportunities for bad actors in our own political system to be able to take advantage of the voting process.
Yes, and I should point out that the Futurist NewDeal is a fully fledged platform. We have a myriad of tax information and tax code reform ideas, but we can kind of boil it down, and also 10 major policies besides these three, but we can kind of boil it down to three things. One being a middle class UBI, second being universal health care, which no civilized society should ever have to do without. And then third on that list is really blockchain secured e-voting, the issue that we're discussing at this time. You are absolutely right in saying that this is a foul institution, these privatized and heavily manipulated voting systems, which we have, all manner of voter suppression and nullification as well, gerrymandering, and when you also add the high tech factors, the big data manipulation, the Cambridge Analyticas, and a dozen other operators besides, and Cambridge Analytica is officially bust. But the guys who ran Cambridge Analytica, they all just stayed together and started another company funded by the same people. So it's not bust at all. It's just rebranding.
That's what they do.
Yes, and and also the voting machine guys have done this before as well. Diebold, I believe, just changed their name when they started to get a lot of flack for throwing so many elections.
And that's what they do. They get caught. They have no personal liability beyond some minor, public back of their hand smacking, and then they just start all over again with the same business model, with the same money making, and they just keep making money, and keep making money, and keep making money, and keep paying the price.
Yeah, and I mean it's easy to always point at institutional problems and right-wing corporatists or corporatists generally to this, but I think our society, we do bear a responsibility for this. I think one of the most common. Go ahead, please go ahead.
Oh, okay. I apologize for the delay. But we allow these things to grow. It's ultimately the responsibility is ours, which is why if we move towards this e-governance, e-voting platform that we've been talking so heavily about, we have the ability to eliminate that opportunity. We need to stop letting these weeds grow in the garden.
Well, so, and it's a
So,
response that I get from too many people, with the very same people who say that everyone should vote, and they're angry that people that some 120 million eligible voters didn't vote in the last presidential election. I don't know if that's the number. Do you know the number off the top of your head?
I don't, but that sounds like a familiar
It's
number.
it's something. It's about as many people as voted for both of the other mainline candidates combined. And the those people who were angry at those non-voters, and also in the same breath, many of them will then, when you're talking about e-voting or legislating for a higher voter turnout, which is something that is also a part of our a part of the Futurist New Deal, those people will basically dismiss this idea. Well, if those people were intellectuals or serious minded people, they would already be voting. I don't trust those people. Very dismissive of working people or people's opinions in general.
Yeah, it's more than a little It's more than a little hypocritical to assume that because a person didn't make it to the poll, that they didn't make it to the poll because they were irresponsible or dismissive of the process as a whole, or just didn't care, didn't want to make a change. I mean, that's the other problem with our current voting structure is life can get in the way. I'll be perfectly frank and disclose this. I missed out on this last election cycle, last election cycle because I was driving my wife to chemo.
And had you had e-voting options or intermediaries therein, you might not have missed that opportunity.
And that's perfectly fair to say. And I can tell you what, my wife would have been sitting there from her infusion chair voting as well.
That's that's a strong individual. I like that reference. I was going to what was I going to say? Something to do with
So let's use that to transition into healthcare.
yes.
So some of the ideas that we've been kicking around for healthcare and others that we've researched more strongly, we think that a good transitional program would be something like a group HSA, whereby people of like mind can buy into this program by contributing to the program. It's not
An HSA is a health savings account.
health savings account.
A sort of public-private partnership, in a word, that already exists within a healthcare legislation.
Yes. So that's something that we could all contribute towards. That could pay for some of the things that are otherwise private insurance, or say if you're on public, like in Arizona, we have access, which doesn't cover a whole lot of great things. It'll help you if you get into a car accident, or it'll help you to the bare minimum if you currently are currently diagnosed with a life-threatening disease. But again, it's the bare minimum. There are other things out there that if you had a couple $100,000 in the bank, you might have access to. You might be able to try.
What would you say? What would you say, Anthony, to all of the people out there who are not transhumanists, who do not have a universal longevity escape velocity in mind as a goal, but who respond to the concept of a health savings account about in the way that they would respond to the idea of legislation that allows for charter schools? They feel that it's a poor use of these public resources and diverting into a system that has a dubious track record.
Well, I would say that when our kids were in a charter school, they were being exposed to Latin, Greek, classical literature, physics in the 4th, 5th, and 6th grade.
Yes, and I actually also
our kids perform.
I actually also taught in a charter school. I taught robotics and engineering to young people, in a program, and it was a very good school. I don't think that the critiques of these are that these programs are unable to produce any result, only that when you look at the ledger and you take a longer view of the society, that they're not as they're these privatization efforts as often as not just result in big payouts for a few people and no greater better use of the resources on the whole.
No, but it can be viewed as in some of the places where it has been successful, like Basis, for example, is a so far to date successful in their implementation of their faster education programs. It is an example where private and public partnership can be a benefit. But then I'm looking around our town here and I'm seeing 3 other charter schools popping up that are taking the place of vacant buildings. I'm not seeing a whole lot of exposure to it, and I can tell you I have people whose kids were tried out there and they pulled their kids out in 3 months. So there's definitely a lot of pitfalls in it, but I don't think this is probably something that we should add into the podcast.
Well, I don't. I think that it's. I think that I was playing the devil's advocate there, but I will say that the Futurist New Deal doesn't have a strong position on the existence of charter schools. Maybe more describing another line of thought, as I said. But
Let's talk about.
we can talk about. Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh no, we while we're on the subject, we should mention that the Futurist New Deal does include a program that would legislate for more e-learning modules in every K through 12 school, and to the extent of which we would say that every K through 12 school would have essentially options for students to be completely online. Do you have any thoughts on online schools?
I think having the opportunity to be entirely online is important. I think making it the only option though would be a mistake. Only because we do have numerous studies that do show that people do have different learning capabilities, and you can have 2 students of perfectly even intelligence between them. One will benefit more from a live interactive education experience compared to one that can do it entirely online. Now that being said,
yes, and to clarify, go ahead. To clarify, the Futurist New Deal position is not to force everyone to absolutely be in an online school, but rather to grow the system, which basically already exists in all suburban or urban communities, wherein students will have the choice to attend online schools if they feel that it furthers their educational goals.
Good, I think that's important.
Yeah, and maybe that should be a separate infographic as well.
And that'd probably be a good idea, because I can give you an anecdotal example of my sister-in-law, who is a brilliant artist and a brilliant-minded general. However, when she was in high school, because of certain social challenges and other issues, she was not fruitful at all. So she ended up dropping out for a period of time. But the moment that she discovered online high school education, she killed it. She absolutely killed it, and it made a huge difference in her life. It was the difference between being just another dropout, getting maybe at some point getting a slightly better job in burger flipping, and having at least a high school education, and then her artistic portfolio behind her. It opened a lot of doors for her.
Yeah, and we should point out she's gone on to great success since, and she's a lovely person.
Yes. And I understand that one person, and that's anecdotal, but it is what I have to share.
Yes.
So.
Yes. We were also maybe going to talk a little bit more about a few other of our programs. We've had discussions about whether it is constitutional to incentivize full voting in various ways. Some people feel that it would be the act of executive overreach for the chief executive or the president to mandate voting requirements, to mandate that everyone must vote. I don't feel that way, but I sympathize with people who have these concerns generally. But it is a part of the Futurist New Deal that we want to incentivize full voting, and so another way to do that would be to provide additional benefits, perhaps tied to some of our other tax reform issues that would allow for that would make people want to vote. And this could be seen as also a stepping stone leading up to the fully secured blockchain e-voting, as much of a more so than something that would come after it. But
Yeah,
you have feelings on
it
this
would
subject.
require a little. It would definitely require a little research on that because I don't know the constitutionality of it. My instinct tells me that it's going to be a challenge.
Yeah.
But I think that.
Well, I did research this quite a bit, and it is a little bit of an open question. But there is wording in the United States Constitution that suggests that certain actions along these kinds, paying people to vote, is unconstitutional. But I think that there's maybe other approaches to this that don't quite go that far. Most of this wording is oriented towards preventing people from being paid or otherwise incentivized for voting for a particular candidate. Not it's the framers for all of their wisdom didn't anticipate a society that where voter suppression and other forces of this kind were so widespread.
Yeah, there's there was definitely a lot more interest when the nation was new. But also remember too that what's getting lost in a lot of the rhetoric now is the so-called 3%ers. What that was 3% of the population that was willing to rebel against the crown, and only 15% of the population that was willing to put blood on the table for it. So you could say that maybe we're used to not having quite the participation that we would hope to get. However, in this day and age, we can do better.
Yes.
And I think the framers of our Constitution, of whom I am a great admirer, would agree that with everything we've accomplished, with everything that we've achieved technologically, with everything that we've achieved sociology, we'd be foolish not to revisit these concepts.
Yes. And I do want to talk about something else that's related to something we spoke of before, which is the leasing of public lands to fund a middle class basic income. And the reason that I want to talk about it is because I think we have a duty to address these more controversial points in our platform. And this one is controversial for many people. And you had some ideas of particular solutions to this. We should say that we would be leasing business space in U.S. national lands to businesses that have a carbon neutral business and business culture, and also to businesses that would be building in a way that's aesthetically in keeping with their surroundings, even to the point of maybe developing underground business parks and things of this kind. But you also, aside from the underground notion, you had some very specific ideas along these lines. So please tell us.
Yes, I did.
Please tell us.
Okay, so I am not a paid endorser at all, but I'm gonna cite Subaru as the model for this.
Yeah, we're not getting free Subarus, sadly.
Yeah, tell me about it. their U.S. manufacturing plant is actually built on a nature preserve, and what they've done is they've eliminated upwards of 98% of any waste from their manufacturing process. It is a non-air polluting facility, and it even goes so far as to not cause sound pollution. And granted, they did this as a way to continue selling cars to the aging hippie generation, but it works. So here's this.
And this is not a full this is not a full automation operation like Elon Musk's Dreadnought, I believe it was
No,
called.
but at the time of its that's correct. But at the time of its inception, it was far more automated than the automotive unions would have enjoyed.
Yes.
But that was the benefit of being a Japanese company. So Fuji Heavy Industries does a lot to automate their facilities pretty much everywhere. That being said, it's a perfect model with a little bit of updating for what we can allow to land lease in our national parks. And we're not talking about going in and clear cutting, 150 acres to make room for a big box in the middle of the woods that builds cars.
Yes, that bears repeating. That bears repeating 100 times.
Yeah. What we're talking about is taking vacant areas that will have very little environmental impact to putting said big block there, like an open plain or a desert area, and allowing these companies to use it for, let's say, back of the envelope number, 100 years, with certain understandings. Certain understandings are similar environmental models, whereby it does not pollute, impact, or cause a permanent footprint. It's where, in 100 years, if they decide to take the business elsewhere, that structure can be removed, the place can be reseeded, and we've done no harm.
Yes.
So that's an important concept. That's an important thing to say, is that in adopting the Open Eastman model and continuing this work, we are not destroying our environment, which I think is our biggest existential risk. And I know the Lifeboat Foundation folks would agree with us on this. We are not here to destroy the environment by doing this. We're here to utilize our resources in a way that makes it possible for our manufacturing and our industry to push forward into the next century, produce better products, cheaper, get it out to the rest of the world, make the rest of the world our customer, and hopefully they follow our model and elevate their people as we're doing.
Yes, and we should say that there's been an overwhelming push amongst corporations and organizations towards a green business culture. It's been less successful in the United States than in many other developed countries, but even so, very prevalent in the U.S. We are at core a pro-business party, and we just want to be finding solutions and not putting our heads in the sand when it comes to things like taking care of the middle class and planning for the future of our society.
Right. And that's what this is all about. There's a lot of politicians out there that have these really great, really marketable, really publicly popular and well-worded ideas to pull votes their direction. And, one might argue that that's a politician's job. But there really isn't any good plan behind it, and there's no acknowledgement for the fact that these things need to be step programs in order to allow things to adapt to it, so you don't create the chaos they keep threatening each other with.
Yes, and when you also consider the extent to which these are micromanaged campaigns and organizations within the two-party system, which have direct strategies. GOP strategists all describe themselves as post-policy, but they have direct strategies towards emphasizing wedge issues that don't directly relate to reforms or humane economic policy. And the Democrats, maybe to a slightly lesser degree, guilty of this, but still playing into this same dog and pony show. It's again a feature of this this kind of Charles Koch brothers type influence operation, and everyone having to feed at that trough of corporatists, and their policies come first, and then if there's time, the actual people of the United States might be considered.
That's a good point, and I can't really add anything to that.
Well, we
But
did. Go
what
ahead.
I would like to bring back is wedge issues. You've used this phrase a lot, and it's a very, very important phrase. Look, I'm gonna feel, and Ben, feel free to edit this out if you think it's going too far.
Please.
I think we need to go to the strongest wedge issue we have going right now, and that's abortion.
Okay.
If you're on the left and you are pro-abortion, as far as the right is concerned, you are you're a baby killing murderer. If you're on the right and you are pro-life, as far as the left is concerned, you are looking to enslave women and use their bodies for baby manufacturing. And that is the kind of mentality that is destroying this country. We are in the 21st century, and while we haven't gotten our hoverboards, we have a lot of really cool stuff.
Yeah. And I should say that both of the parties in this conversation are pro-choice. We're talking about a misframing of issues, not taking an anti-choice position. Please continue.
So we have the ability now to extract a developing embryo, preserve that embryo, and then with the coming, as they call it, biobag, the artificial womb technology, be able to gestate that embryo at another time for a couple that can't have children who might want to adopt that child.
Yeah, and that
the ability to say to the mother
that's a prototype that exists. That's not something out of Aldous Huxley. That's a prototype that exists.
It's a prototype.
Yes.
Exactly. It is a real potential. It's not a pipe. It's not a pipe dream.
Yes.
So we have the ability to take a woman in a situation where she is pregnant and she does not want to be pregnant, whether it's because of a violent attack, or it's because of incest, or she's not ready to be a mother, not economically or personally, any number of reasons why she should not have to be forced to have this child right now, and say, not a problem, your conscience is clear. We're going to extract the embryo at this stage, we're going to preserve it, you sign it off, and at some point in the future, somebody who can, or maybe even yourself, can have that child through technology or through any number of things that might come down the pipeline. So we have the ability to mute this argument right now and say.
And we could also say that any number of other fertility medicine technologies having been emphasized would have had a similar effect. And not all of those things are quite so operatic in scale as artificial wombs.
Which may not even be operatic in 5 years. For all we know, next year it may be incredibly simple, and it's probably going to be big agro that's going to push this thing for the purpose of getting more cows and pigs out there on the market shelf.
Yes.
Who knows?
Yes. But that's uncontroversial. But it would be, if this were a central post of the Futurist New Deal, it might be regarded by even some very staunch techno-optimists as a vulnerable point.
Fair enough. But the driving point to the conversation is that we have the ability within our party, and we have the sensibility within our party, to eliminate a lot of these wedge issues just by the technology that we have.
Yeah, and I think
we'll extra money into these things, instead of arguing about where the money is going, we mute the argument altogether.
And you definitely pushed us right up to the edge there with that conversation. But I think this critique of the wedge issue, because if you add some historicity to this conversation, we've had 40 years of the Christian right using abortion as their number one most visible issue. I would argue that segregation is really their number one issue, but their number one most visible issue towards galvanizing their base. But in fact, a slightly better society would have emphasized these new fertility medicine developments that would have circumvented this conversation entirely, effectively removing all abortion on some time scale similar to our own.
That is absolutely true, and it's been the case.
It's certainly worth saying.
Technology.
Yes.
For for decades, the party politics retards the development, period.
Yes.
And, these are technologies that could have been available, maybe even 20 years ago.
Yes.
The ones that I just discussed.
Yes.
But, here we are playing the game still.
I guess in the same breath we might speak of technocracy as a concept, and versus technocracy as it's used colloquially to maybe it's tending to be used by people who maybe low information voters, anti-science people, not people who have strong ties to the transhumanist parties and philosophies. Certainly, what are your feelings on technocracy, the historical movements of technocracy, and technocracy in the early 21st century?
Well, for starters, I'd like to point out that the word itself can be really scary. Depending on what generation you're talking to, the first thing that pops into their mind is going to be either Terminator or THX or any number of scenarios where a writer says that technology will end the world.
Yeah.
So that can be a scary word. But
Okay.
the reality of it
Let's put a okay. Go ahead.
leveraging a tool. The reality of it is leveraging a tool. Technology is our tool. Technology is our strongest tool. Technology is the means by which we first lit the fires to the means by which we launched man to space. All we're really talking about here is not being afraid to reach into our toolbox, take the right socket and the right wrench, and get to work.
Yes.
And I think that's what we need to concentrate on.
So let's put it in a little more specific context, because it is partially a weasel word because it would encompass so many institutions and ideas, not only because it appeals to anti-science people. So let's put it in a little more specific context. Zoltan Istvan wrote an article called "Could a Robot Run for President?" Which doesn't describe something as farcical as you might suppose. It rather describes advanced algorithms being able to be key decision makers in constructing and controlling policy. Would you have any thoughts on the idea of this kind of movement towards an algocracy?
Well, I think that's a mistake. And not because I don't have any faith in AI or because I don't have any faith in the algorithms, but mainly because I don't see one being necessarily a perfect substitute for the other.
This is something which you and I, the two architects of the... Go ahead, sorry.
I was going to say, there's numerous instances where the best results have come from a partnership of human imagination and technology's ability to analyze things that we can't as fast as it can.
Yes.
Life-saving medical decisions have been made by a combination of a simple search algorithm and a good doctor. If we expand that to the next step, where, to use the presidential, the presidential context, you have a president who is, and we don't have one right now, but if you have a president who is tuning in to the human side of the equation and a machine that is working the numbers, with the information, with all that information at a person's fingertips, they have the best chance of making the right decision. However, if the machine makes the decision solely, while it may be ultimately the most correct decision, it may not be the most humane. And that's something that we need to be cautious of while we're in this stage of AI. We're not quite at the artificial superintelligence phase. We're nowhere near it, actually. We're barely even understanding what artificial general intelligence is.
Yes, and I'm going to interrupt you there, Anthony. I'm going to interrupt you there for a second because I want to refer back to the Futurist New Deal. One of the key points of the Futurist New Deal is reform of things like Citizens United, and what I'm specifically reminded of in this context is not only repealing Citizens United, but making ALEC, this law writing mechanism, this corporatist law writing mechanism, illegal. And I understand your concerns with algocracy because it seems like a hyper-capitalist extension of something like ALEC if depending on its implementation.
Right, and the implementation temptation is what concerns me the most. I'm not worried about the device itself. I'm worried about those that will abuse it in its earliest stages before we have a chance to get a handle on it.
Yes.
We, the people.
Yes, but that is not the kind of system I think that Zoltan Istvan was describing in his article and some of the articles that have been written on the subject. And I for one, view an egalitarian algocracy as an important long-term goal, in the same way that I view a universal longevity escape velocity as an important long-term goal. I don't necessarily. I see. It's possible that universal longevity escape velocity might not ever prove to be implementable. It might, but it's even more possible that an algocracy might not prove to be palatable or implementable to people. But I think that there's still things that could provide a tremendous value to our society, and
absolutely. There's my dad used to crack a joke, and it wasn't his, but he liked to quote it. If you shoot for the moon but you land on the roof, you're still up.
Yeah, excellent.
So here we are talking about, spacefaring futures. We're talking about orbiting space rings that could also become extended habitats. We're talking about colonizing other planets. We're talking about long-term deep space travel. If we don't shoot, we're never going to get there.
Yes.
And
I would.
We've talked a lot about our bridges. We've talked a lot about bridges, the mechanisms by which we get to the next step.
Yes.
Once we cross that bridge, we're going to learn things that we never thought we were going to experience before we cross that bridge. So, we're going to have to adapt, and we're going to have to be willing to change when we get there. But in the meantime, we still need to get there. And the programs that we're discussing, the importance of them, those are our bridges, and we need to be prepared to build them and cross them.
Yes. And I would like to say on this subject, in conversations I've had with the presumptive frontrunner in this race, Rachel Haywire, she's described herself as a visionary in this regard. But if you look at the content that she's publishing and the way that she's promoting her campaign, she's not really describing bridges. She's not really describing policy platforms at all. She's pointing a lot more to puff pieces, to soft news, to human interest stories. Like I think the most recent thing I saw that she shared was a story about a man who identifies as a space alien. A wonderful story, a kind of conversation that transhumanists should be having with everyone, I believe. But at the end of the day, this is not something that relates at all to policy. It's something that would be more suitable if Rachel Haywire were starting a transhumanist tabloid or lifestyle magazine than running for high office.
I would agree. And the thing is here, these are the kind of people that are going to make transhumanism popular.
Yeah.
It'll make it popular. It'll get it out there. It'll attract a number of different types of countercultures and subcultures. But it's not going to create the environment in which they can thrive.
Well, it's not what our predecessor Zoltan Istvan did. He wasn't. He was publishing human interest pieces, but ones that relate specifically to not just to emerging culture, but to a political or public health objectives.
I would also like to point out that I don't know a single visionary that ever called themselves a visionary. It's usually others that call them a visionary. So that's kind of important.
Yes. I'm not going to go so far as that, but that's a good point. Certainly, people have a right to brand and promote ideas and use a strong language to do so. But that does tend to happen. Just as people when people say in conversation honestly, you can't always have to wonder if they were ever being honest before.
as a fellow New Yorker, though, I take exception to regression. Our colloquialisms are kind of special.
Fair enough. uh,
But I'd like to dial back real quick to the healthcare options.
yes.
With the one that we discussed, the HSA idea,
Mm-hmm.
to sort of supplement an existing insurance is a really important one to me. But the other thing that I look at is the MediShare exemption, the Christian MediShare exemption. That system allows multiple people of like mind, and we're taking the religious equation out of it. That system allows multiple people of like mind to come together into what is essentially a large group HSA and share each other's medical expenses.
Yes. Okay, and this is a kind of a risk sharing organization. I want to stop you for a second. This is a risk sharing organization, a healthcare risk sharing organization called MediShare. Sort of sounds like Medicare, but share at the end. And these guys do have a religious affiliation. There's a few others of about the same size that also have a religious affiliation doing this. Please go on.
Yes. So thank you. No, very important disclaimer. That being said, what exactly? And I'm asking this of any insurance professional or lawyer out there that can help us answer this question. What is stopping us from being able to establish a similar system, whereby, as we as transhumanists view things like, and it's not always the case for everyone, but view things as cryonics as a reasonable medical case when you're out of options. Do you really need to have a life insurance policy to pay for something like that, or should it be considered potential for a future treatment? Nanotech options that are not readily available in the insurance stream. One of the things that we ran into, thank God that we had private insurance as well, but a lot of the genetic testing that went on with my wife's cancer was not going to be covered by the VA, because the VA's view of those things was they were too new. Your treatment options through the Veterans Association are easily 10 years behind tech because it's all that Congress has approved yet. I kid you not, the VA determines what is a viable treatment for you by whether or not Congress has authorized them to pay for it.
Yes, and I would like to say of the Futurist New Deal platform that we are for mandating a public and universal health care beyond what exists today. However, the systems that you're describing and the question that you asked, I believe we are now, because of changes to the ACA, Obamacare, we would be better poised to develop this localized organization, or rather this organization which I would prefer to work on at a local level, an HSA for transhumanists. I believe it would be easier to do than it was, say, 6 years ago. I'm sorry, 4 years ago, let's say. 6 years ago, I don't believe there was an... Yeah.
The ACA did a lot of good for certain groups of people. For other groups of people, it caused some hardships, but the worst thing it did, and I don't believe it was intentional, I think it was just a fact of how the legal cheese grater works. It truncated access to a lot of emerging medical technologies. Now that changes have been made and certain things have been defunded, and we're not going to get into political wars on what part of that's right and what part of that's wrong, but it has opened up a scenario where something like what we're talking about with transhumanist HSAs or transhumanist MediShares, or maybe even collective bargaining with major insurance companies to benefit us, that is now possible again, and we need to jump on that while we can.
Yes, yes. And I would like to say that these concerns about what the ACA has done and can do are good concerns. Unfortunately, the changes that have been made to the ACA in the past few years are basically contributing to some few thousand a year more deaths. In criticizing the ACA, I don't think there's ever much of a case. We must, in the same breath, also say that we need a single payer or equivalent system that is implemented across the country.
Yeah, I'd like to refer to what Thailand did when it started structuring its healthcare system. Now they have they still have limited access because of resources to some of the things that we might have in Western countries. But what they did was they looked at Japan, they looked at China, they looked at Austria, they looked at Germany, they looked at Denmark, and they looked at the United Kingdom and America, and they looked at what we're doing in our healthcare systems that works. And they looked, and now mind you, this is more than 25 years ago. They looked at what wasn't working. And surprise, surprise, they didn't adopt what wasn't working, and they did adopt what did.
Yes.
How are we not smart enough to do that too?
Yes.
It's 2019. You know?
And I would referring to other, it's always a good thing to have perspective on history and also perspective on public policy in other nations. I also think of Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has a tiny fraction of the U.S. GDP and a small fraction of U.S. per capita GDP, and even with pricing parity considerations built into it. But Sri Lanka basically has public health outcomes equal to the United States. Life expectancy in the United States has gone down quite a bit in the last few years. So a male in Sri Lanka lives as long as a male in the United States within a standard deviation. And the reason that they've done this, I believe, is because they had a specific set of phenomenon. After 1948, when they became independent, they became a hard left country, in a word, a communist country, for a few years, and then it didn't actually work that well at that time. It wasn't the best choice for them, or really for too many people in history, maybe anyone. But it did create a populist consensus within the country. So when they moved their government to a capitalist form, they had something more like maybe a Liz Warren style government, where things were very regulated, and they immediately then began implementing a public health system, which has led to decade by decade dramatic growth in healthcare outcomes, to the point where even though they are a poor country relative to the United States, they are as healthy as the United States, at least the men living as long, and the women living also almost as long. I think when we think about what we're trying to do in this organization, we should think about those populist sentiments and try to appeal to them, even if we don't truly believe in a revolutionary upheaval of these government systems.
What we need to remind people is that what we're focused on is life.
Yes.
We're focused on saving lives and ensuring the health, happiness, and prosperity of existing lives. And the systems that we're talking about are important bridges to that scenario. And, people are going to throw names at us like utopianists, communists, socialists. Let's get a couple of things straight. These are words. These are constructs. These are ways of demonizing points of view that you don't necessarily understand or agree with. I want to throw them all out the window. Communism, crap. Republicanism, crap. Liberalism, crap. What does it all boil down to? Life. And are we able to live our lives? And we need to be focused on removing barriers that can inhibit a person's life. I keep yelling this at the top of my lungs. It is 2019. We may not have our hoverboards and flush capacitors, but we've got a lot of really cool stuff. And if we take the time to look up into that ether of orphan technologies that's floating over our heads, of things that we could be utilizing but we're not utilizing, bring them down to earth with goals in mind, we can make leaps and bounds.
Yes. Do we want to talk about the article that we've been editing about space civilization and near-Earth development and ultimately space elevator or orbital ring design?
Well, to be frank, you're far more educated in that than I am, but I would like to make one point of how important that drive is to transhumanists. NASA has been releasing pretty much on the regular health reports on their astronauts, and just the incredible toll it takes not only on their health during their tour of service, but also on their long-term health once they return to Earth. And that's an eye-opener. That's something that, you know, Musk and Bezos and everybody else involved in the privatized spacefaring industry need to pay attention to, because mankind is not biologically ready. Although we may be intellectually ready, we are not biologically ready for space travel.
Well,
I
go ahead. Your statement brings to mind this science fiction movie, which wasn't particularly great. I think it was called The Titan with Sam Worthington,
yeah.
Where there's a bioengineered solution to humans living on Mars. But that point brings up an excellent idea, and I think a blind spot for a lot of transhumanists, which is, you know, we have a large amount of private and historically public funds going into space travel with a mind to going to Mars. But in point of fact, if life on Earth becomes as life on Earth becomes more difficult due to climate change or other factors, it would cost pennies on the dollar to be building a subterranean society or aquatic or subaquatic society compared to building a ship that will take 7 billion people to a distant planet. It doesn't really pass the laugh test. What Musk is trying to do.
That's not to belittle the fact that statistically having, you know, mankind in multiple locations is probably good for, you know, our long-term survival.
Yes, in long term, it's very good, I suppose. My criticism is the amount of public or private resources that have been poured into this instead of more earthbound matters.
Yeah. But you know, the technologies that we can be utilizing now and in the future that fortify human life as it is here, you know, genetics, nanotechnology, cybernetics, any combination of the above, that enhance the human condition here, dramatically lengthen our lives, reduce the ways that we can die just from our environment and accident, will serve us in being able to actually get off this planet for whatever reason, whether it's to, you know, whether it's because we're due for another extinction level event or not, whether it's just to explore and expand the sum of human knowledge. Whatever the motivation is, we're not going to do it if we think that the only way we're going to do it is to build cool ships and interesting habitat. No, we need to fortify the person as well, and in doing so for a sense of life here, we make it easier to take humans out into the solar system, out into the heavens, as it were.
And that description brings to mind the a model for a future human being who is genetically engineered to a T, but maybe that person may ideologically be a technological Luddite. A person could be engineered for any number of longevity or other more skilled type optimizations, but still have no interest in digital technology or advanced technology.
You know, to be perfectly frank, I can see a future for myself where, you know, most of the things that, you know, biologically might want to kill me have been edited out. I've got respirocytes, you know, improving my blood oxygen content. I've got, you know, an artificial pancreas and an artificial heart, and, you know, my joints have been replaced, and, you know.
I should say that the artificial pancreas is less of a far future thing than these others.
Say what now?
I just want to say that the artificial pancreas is less of a far future thing than these others.
Exactly.
There are artificial pancreases that are coming to market.
That's what I'm getting at. I'm just using myself as a model.
Yeah.
You know, these are just all of these things that I just described that I could drastically extend my lifespan and, you know, change how my environment can affect me, are just incremental medical treatments that I've received over decades that were not controversial. But now how long am I going to live with, I don't have to worry about my organs breaking down. How long am I going to live if my DNA has additional repair mechanisms that keeps it producing healthy copies? How long am I, all of these questions come to fruition, and it all happened because I went and saw my doctor.
And I mean, many people might dismiss this idea.
I may still, with all of these improvements, enhancements, and replacements, just want to hike around, for the Grand Canyon, which I can do a lot easier now because of my Respiro.
Yes.
Maybe I just want to sit there and fish for a while. Who knows? So the fact that some people may not want to live on another planet, or may not want to live in an orbital ring, or may not even want to upload to a digital substrate, or whatever other forms that transhumanity may take in the future, doesn't mean that it's not going to happen anyway.
Yes, and also, at least of the biologically based life extension, people might hear you say something like Respirosites and so forth, and want to say that this is that we're talking about science fiction. But I think if you talk to someone like George Church, arguably the most accomplished geneticist alive, he would say that almost everything that you've listed is coming at a quicker and quicker clip. And
that's my point.
Yes, and there's almost no model, I think, where life extension technologies are more than 15 years away in the developed world.
We just learned how to edit out Down syndrome in utero.
Yes. Yes, that's an incredible accomplishment.
Yeah, like you said, the artificial pancreas is right around the corner. The artificial heart is about to not only just be around the corner, but shortly thereafter exceed the capability and longevity of the human heart, and it runs entirely on ATP and glucose. No need for an external power source. It's thanks to material sciences, its moving mechanisms are self-lubricating. It has its own inherent lubricity. It flips off itself without a problem. We don't have to worry about things wearing down in that regard. These are some of the things that we talk about when we talk about orphan technologies that need to come down out of the ether and be applied in a purposeful direction.
And I would hope that fellow transhumanists, in looking at the Futurist New Deal, looking at these economic populist and near-term e-governance implementations, would not think that we are not connected to these other goals. We may tend to have an emphasis more on the biological life extension than on the digital concerns. Although, of course, there's no conversation about any of this stuff without digital technology.
Oh yeah, and it's not like, and there's no conversation we can have about this that is going to encompass every viewpoint all at once.
No.
Yeah.
But yes, I think that the presumptive frontrunner in this race, Rachel Haywire, has tried to poise herself as a leading intellectual on ideas relating to techno-optimism compared to the other candidates. But I'm really not sure that I'm hearing a lot of real substance from her. I hope that we get a chance to talk more, even outside of these debates. I do want to say that she has a strong history with a lot of these groups, and she's written a lot on these subjects. She's no slouch by any stretch of the imagination. I think that the JBZ 2020 campaign, my campaign, is the better choice for actual policy implementations and also visibility. We have an influence operation of some considerable size relative to the other candidates. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, I would say that I think Rachel has a talent for, if anything, publicizing some of the points that we're getting across, but I don't think she has the ability to build the framework for it. And whereas I believe we do. I believe we have the ability to reach out and recognize the talent out there in the sphere that can implement a lot of these things, bring them together, get them working on a common goal and a project, and have things ready-made for those days when we do have the opportunity to influence legislature and we do have the ability to influence candidates as a whole. The Green Party arguably has never succeeded in really electing anybody of any consequence in any office. They've had electoral success, but not really any kind of policy success. That being said, every single mainstream candidate has to answer questions on the environment.
Yes, green basically make some concessions to Green Party doctrine.
Exactly, and I think that is their greatest success. I think that's their greatest influence, and I think we can do that as well.
And I think we should be so lucky, very, very lucky, and count ourselves blessed if we were to have even a small fraction of that success in moving our society towards a universal longevity escape velocity.
Well, I think that we have that potential, and let me explain why. I think we have more potential in that sphere than the Green Party, because the Green Party is very, very, very specialized. And as we see in nature and evolution, the specialization only works for so long before, even non-man-made environmental circumstances will kill you off pretty quick. What we were talking about encompasses so many different factors. Our economic policy, our tax reform, UBI, etc., our healthcare policy, all of this creates an environment in which radical life extension is possible. We're not simply focused on the environment because the environment is the focus of our party. We're focusing on the environment because its destruction is an existential risk to us all. We're focusing on healthcare not because we're a policy focused on healthcare, but because not having it and not having it in abundance and in constant growth is an existential risk to all of us. We have an economic policy because without an economic policy to create the environment in which any of the previously mentioned points are possible, we get nowhere. We have a space policy, same reason. And it just goes on and on and on as to why transhumanism as a philosophy is really all-encompassing of humanity. And the more we're out there, the more we're educating people, the more we're having conversations like this, the more people realize, I don't have to be a Democrat, I don't have to be a Republican, I don't have to be a Libertarian. I can be better than that. I can be better than partisan politics. I can be a human. And that's most important.
Yes. And I would like to say also along these lines, a point that people may not have considered, and it relates to a contrast between the Green New Deal and the Futurist New Deal. But I should say that I don't mean to criticize. This is not actually at all a criticism of the Green New Deal, but it relates more to the way that people tend to think. And I think there's actually less ideological barriers to life extension than there is to an overwhelming concern with ecocide or existential damage to the existential risk associated with extreme damage to the environment. And part of that is just that for whatever reason, it's a little easier for people to point to, for example, many people on the right side, on the naysaying side of climate change, they point to law of unintended consequences, an uncertainty as to whether Earth is truly getting warmer or colder. Things of this kind, and all manner of sophistry, which is not has little to do with better outcomes.
That's another example of a wedge issue. That's another perfect example of a wedge issue that is one side is focusing on a very, very small aspect of it, the other side is focusing on another very small aspect of it, and we the people are not able to then pay attention to the problem as a whole.
Yes.
So,
and the green, but it definitely is an easier sell, I think, if you're talking about life extension, because we've described this phrase a baseline transhumanist in the platform.
I like that phrase. That was a new one that you introduced me to.
Oh yeah. It. Well, I've heard variants of that before, and I've chosen this one, term that I've coined, but I can't take credit for the concept itself. But it's the idea that your mother or father go to the doctor, and as artificial pancreases come to market, your mother or father or someone else will be accepting them as they are funded. So
Let
there's
me simplify it. Let
yes,
me simplify it for some of our listeners who are new to this concept. Very simply put, if you are 45 years old and your parent is still alive, your parent is a transhumanist
yes,
because they have been the beneficiary of medical technologies, nutritional technologies, things along the way that have given them access to things that their parents didn't have and their parents didn't have. Now,
yes,
you can point
and
to the
they're well
98-year-old World
poised.
War II veteran, but he's an exception to the rule. Not normally, if you're under normal circumstances, if you're 45 years old and your mom and dad are still alive, your mom and dad are transhumanists. They just don't think of it that way.
Yes, and
End of
that's
story.
that's to say that everyone under a certain age is well poised to become a transhuman, whether they ever have any relationship to transhumanist ideologies or not.
Exactly.
Um,
And in some way, if any of us are alive or just living a better life because of a medical technology or an assistive technology or an educational technology that we've had access to along the way, we are reaping the benefits of a transhuman philosophy. And in that way, what we're talking about here is not space cadet stuff. This is life.
yes,
And everything we do to improve life, whether it's the longevity of life or the quality of life, or a combination of the two, is a transhumanist concept.
mm,
We just put a better name on it.
yeah. I wanted to call back something we talked to just like about 4 minutes ago, when in talking about this climate denialism debate, which is a term that I just learned a few days ago, and it's related to it's in the gaslighting spectrum of ideas, but this term is called sea lioning, and sea lioning is described as a form of trolling involving bad faith questions. You frame the conversation disingenuously, trying to be enlightened on the subject, but actually causing the defender of this position to then do uh, lay out a great deal of information that's not necessary, and it's kind of and harassing them about this information along the way.
It's like journalistic baiting.
Yes. What is it
You're
called?
not really you're not really there to ask an important question or to report the news. You're there to bait the person into depicting themselves in front of you so you can report it.
Yeah.
It's not productive.
Yeah. And I know it's not considered particularly tasteful to describe the left as uniformly the good guys and the right as uniformly the bad guys. But this is a right wing tactic. It's the Heritage Foundation has written pamphlets to people describing ways to gaslight people who may be more progressive. This is almost exclusively a tactic of people on that would be associated more with the radical right than anything else.
I'm with you. You're talking to somebody who listens to people like Ben Shapiro and the Young Turks in the same vein. I like to hear it from both sides when I turn up the volume.
Yeah. I've invited a podcaster who had an anti-transhumanist podcast. This podcast was called Before the First Cup with Jules. Her name is Jules. And she was an anti-transhumanist podcaster who did a daily podcast basically running down all manner of R&D across the tech spectrum, but from an anti-transhumanist perspective. And even though she was extremely critical of techno-progressive developments and ideas and corporate business practices, which in many cases are rather questionable, if not highly objectionable.
Yes.
But it was a fascinating program. I think I recommended it to a number of transhumanists. I invited her to maybe discuss the Futurist New Deal with me, but she's in poor health now. That's part of the reason that she stopped doing her podcast. I think she may have recovered. I'm not certain, but I hadn't heard back from her. But I recommend people. You just mentioned listening to the Young Turks and Ben Shapiro at the same time. I do recommend that people listen to opinions different from their own.
Absolutely.
But on
I
the
think the
whole, I would
biggest
say
problem with the climate debate, I
listen
think the
to
biggest problem
listen
with
to
the
new
climate debate is
ideas.
that people don't do that.
Yeah.
There's and it's so doing they don't understand where the other side's coming from, whichever side they're on. There's you know you could say the Republican side, they have all of this scientific data that shows that it's part of a natural cycle of the Earth, and man-made pollution accounts for, I think the last one I heard was like 0.015% of CO2 in the atmosphere, and of that, the United States is responsible for 0.00015% of that. And it goes on and on and on and on and on. Which is why we're not the bad guys, and it's not our responsibility, and so on and so forth. And then on the other side of it, you have equally strong numbers. And you got to wonder where are all these conflicting pieces of data coming from? If science is science. Well, the fact is that science is not science. Science is often heavily influenced by who's paying for it. And if that one fact alone, that science as it is now is often heavily influenced by who's paying for it, really scares you, you might just be a transhumanist.
Yeah. And I will say one more thing. If you're going to the trouble of listening to Jordan Peterson or Ben Shapiro, I generally don't spend too much time listening to these guys. I want to hear new ideas from different parts of the spectrum, certainly. But if you're going to the trouble of listening to any intellectual dark web guy, Eric Weinstein, not a bad guy for that. But taking all of this with a grain of salt, I really would urge anyone listening to right wing ideas to take everything as a rhetorical exercise rather than gospel.
My view is that if it comes from a politician, a person whose job is to convince you to basically hire them for a job that they're not really going to do, they're going to take entire summers off while you're still working in order to pay your taxes, in order to continue to pay these people, you should probably consider the source.
Yeah, that's true. There's no shortage of intellectual laziness among people in the political class.
My favorite was the religious documentary that Bill Maher did.
Sure.
And there's been plenty of times where I've disagreed with Bill Maher, and plenty of times where I've sat there and laughed my ass off and loved the show.
Yeah.
But my favorite was when he's interviewing that, I'm just not putting any names out there, but a Southern senator. The Southern senator said something to the effect of, "Well, you don't have to pass an IQ test to be in the Senate." And Bill Maher just stood there looking at him, shocked, and the guy's face blanched as he realized the words that just came out of his mouth on the camera. It was beautiful. It was beautiful.
Yeah. We haven't talked too much in our campaign about secular humanist values. You mentioned a film called Religulous. It's partly in the same. I think it's in the same vein as describing the baseline transhumanist. It's not the goal of this organization to destroy people's spiritualism or connection to their communities. And also you and I both have complicated histories here.
Beliefs, yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.